the Conservatives I speak to behind the scenes have said we should probably move towards a living wage. It would be the best thing for the Tory party to show that they get low-pay Britain and the reality of living in Britain at the bottom end of the economy. And they've always said the reason they can't is because the Treasury and George Osborne are quite queasy about it. It's because historically, over time, Tories have felt that if you are too heavy-handed with how Britain's employers should pay their staff, that they will employ fewer people. Back in 1997, when Tony Blair introduced a minimum wage, lots of Tories were up in arms about it then. And over time, many people say they've been proven wrong. But nonetheless, Tories have not wanted to go the whole hog and go towards a living wage. But that is exactly what they've done today, with huge element of surprise. It was a really, really well-guarded secret.
Well, we've all been trying to digest the budget. I have to say, for my money, I think it was extraordinary. It was much bigger than I thought it was going to be, and I know a lot of people have been saying it was going to be big. And it leaves a rather sort of complicated, I think, picture of the Chancellor, because two-thirds very conservative, a very ambitious fiscal plan for the end of the Parliament, of a balanced budget, big cuts, bigger cuts than I thought he would probably achieve on welfare, complete reversal, if you like, of the direction of the Blair-Brown years and tax credits, the firm Chancellor, resolute Chancellor, squeezing public sector pay, I think, more than most of us thought he would try to do. All of that two-thirds Tory, and yet, one-third, you might say, Ed Miliband. The attack on non-doms, the reprofiling of the figures on public spending that allow him to have a much easier spending review for the first half of this Parliament than I think any of us had expected. So in that sense, it all looks a lot easier. And then, of course, the rabbit out the hat at the end, the living wage thing, which is really a minimum wage. It was actually the policy that Ed Miliband would have liked, but didn't dare to suggest in the election campaign. So one might say that if one looked at the election campaign and the arguments that were being had at that time, some of them looked like two parties perhaps in retrospect closer than we'd realised.
In some ways, the big stories when it comes to public finances and the public spending forecast today is a big scaling back in the austerity the Chancellor had planned. He still gets to the same end point he wanted to be at the end of the Parliament, but he gets there in a much slower way. So what the Office of Budget Responsibility had called the roller coaster in public spending, the idea you were going to see really deep cuts in the first few years and then an increase in public spending, has been smoothed out. That V shape has been replaced with a much more gradual curve. So in the next 2 years, the spending cuts are nowhere near as big for the departments as we thought they were going to be. And that's given the Chancellor room for a lot of giveaways. So the 2% NATO target on defence spending will now be hit. That had been looking under threat. And as the Office of Budget Responsibility have said in their report today, the spending review we're getting in the autumn, when we find out the allocation between departments, now feels much more manageable and like it's going to be a much easier process. So we get to the same point, but because we slow it down, everything gets a bit easier for the Chancellor.
So I was struck by two quite big controversial calls in this budget. The first of those was a cut to benefits paid to people who claim a benefit called the Employment and Support Allowance, who are in something called the Work-Related Activity Group. They'll now get the same amount of cash as people who claim the Job Seekers Allowance. Now that's quite a big call, because people in the Work-Related Activity Group are people who we think might be able to work at some point in the future, but can't do so probably right now. And so we'll be paying people who we think are basically disabled people who can't get a job immediately, the same as people we expect to get a job immediately. And that's tough, right? That's a really big call. The second thing I was struck by was university. So Laura, my colleague, has already reported that we expected a lot of support given to students for their living costs to turn from grants into loans, and that's happened. The second thing is the government has indicated it might let universities who do well on teaching quality to raise their fees above the current £9,000 a year cap. Now that's a really big thing, because it means one of either two things. Either they're basically going to say every university is excellent and they can all raise their fees, or they're going to start differentiating between universities and saying this one's good at teaching, this one's bad at teaching. And generally, governments have been very, very loath to distinguish and differentiate between higher education institutions.